In developing countries, one of the challenges that we face is the lack of strong institutions that support the actualization of the SDGs. So when we begin to build our institution and to continue to train capacity in that regard, both in the public and private sector, it goes a long way.
Welcome back to the Green Hour. We are on episode 10, the final episode of our Concordia Summit Series. These are conversations that we recorded at the Concordia Annual Summit. And on this final episode, we have a special guest, Naomi Nwokolo, the Executive Director of the United Nations Global Compact Nigeria. Naomi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Preston. It's good to be here.
Yeah, so I think the first question that I kind of want to unpack is just to understand your background. I mean, before we got on this call, we were talking about, where we both are right now, and I'm in the Atlanta, Georgia area. You're in Nigeria, but you actually said that you called Atlanta home for a little while. So could you just talk about your background a little bit and how you became this executive director for the United Nations Global Compact Nigeria?
Oh, yeah, thanks very much, Preston. So, like I said earlier, my name is like we're discussing before we got on. My name is Naomi Nwokolo. I head the UN Global Compact Nigeria, and I also chair the African region of the United Nations Global Compact. We call it the Regional Network Council, covering 11 countries in Africa, to the Global National Council, then located in New York City. So I have a lot of background. I am a dual licensed attorney from Nigeria and the US. I'm a member of the Nigerian Bar Association and a member of the State Bar of Georgia in Atlanta. I attended Emory Law in Atlanta, Georgia, and I also have my first law degree from Nigeria as well. So kind of like dual licensed attorney from both states and really understanding various legal perspectives from Nigeria and the US. But focusing on my job at the UN Global Compact in Nigeria, I call myself an international development attorney. So we work with the private sector in Nigeria to align their operations with 10 universal principles in the area of labor, human rights, the environment, and anti-corruption. So really like mobilizing the business community to embed their operations with our universal principles, and then also put the SDGs at the core of what they're doing in business, because we know that we cannot really exclude the private sector when we talk about development and the actualization of the UN development goals. Yeah.
Well, awesome. That's the International Development Attorney. That's pretty cool. And you've gotten these degrees in both, or attorney in both Atlanta and Nigeria. That's really cool stuff. I think the first thing that I want to dive into is, understanding just the landscape of Nigeria. I mean, the first episode in the series, we talked to Peter Fernhead, who is the CEO of African Parks, the African Parks Network. And we talked a little bit about Africa, but obviously not too much in depth. But the note that I have down on Nigeria is a developing country, but it's the largest economy in Africa. So I'm just interested to know a little bit more about the area, and I know our listeners are too. So could you give us just a landscape of Nigeria, the economy, what's driving it, the environmental pieces of it, and then what are some challenges right now for the area?
Okay, thanks so much, Preston. So in Nigeria, like you said, is a developing country, but we have the largest economy in Africa. We have the large demographics when it comes to youth. And there's so much opportunities here in the country when it comes to investment, SDG investment, and also the various bits of the sector when it comes to entrepreneurship, green investment, tech. The conversations have been around Africa or Nigeria, especially become the next Silicon Valley because of the number of youth who are involved in technology. So yeah, we do a lot. There's business going on in manufacturing. There's businesses in the oil and gas sector. There's business in the tech space. Like I said earlier, agriculture is also where businesses are really thriving on. And then even if manufacturing, you look at the Dangotes and the cement industry and how they're taking actions and expanding in Africa. And in agriculture, there's a lot of working on food security. So it's really interesting to see how the sectors are growing and businesses is really booming. It's not really easy. For the challenges, there's still issue around the ease of doing businesses, but the Nigerian business landscape, they're very resilient. And it's also important to see that Nigeria, the businesses are taking actions on sustainability. We've moved moved from core CSR, and now businesses are looking at do they really implement human rights in their operation? How do they take actions to implement environmental environmental solutions to really take care of the environment where their businesses thrive on. Businesses are looking at transformational governance to ensure that corruption does not exist anywhere in their operations. Businesses are prioritizing labor rights, while conversations are around minimum wage. Businesses are looking at living wage and how to make sure that people who work for them are not below the poverty line. So it's really interesting to see that the Nigerian business community are taking actions in that regard and contributing to the achievement of the SDGs in Nigeria.
So the note that I have down, I know this conversation, we're really going to focus on the SDGs and how they're related to Nigeria and then investment as a whole. I mean, looking at developing countries, but the note that I have down is there's a $2.5 trillion funding gap for SDG related investments in developing countries. And the way I look at the SDGs are global, right? And when I talk to people in the US about, different conversations, I'm like, in the US, we're this one area of the world. And if we do all these things correct, great. But if everywhere else in the world is not doing the same thing, then there's going to be a disconnect. So every area, every continent of the world has to be together, and we got to be working together to make these large scale goals like the SDGs happen. So I would just ask you, could we dive into this huge funding gap that there is for SDG related investments in developing countries? And why that's important, because again, if there's not investments in place, then we really can't make large scale change like we need to adopt some of these goals.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think that's much understandable now. So I get it. There is currently a 2.5 trillion annual funding gap for SDG related investment in developing countries, and Nigeria is one of them, which emphasizes the need for private sector involvement. Like I said earlier, African businesses, particularly in Nigeria, they really do play a pivotal role in contributing significantly to economic output and job creation. So narrowing it down to the work that we do at the United Nations Global Compact, we continue to mobilize the companies to adopt SDG-aligned practices that addresses both global challenges such as poverty, inequality, and climate change, and also localized challenges that we face as a country. Then, so when we align with the SDGs, it's not really just about the responsibility. It opens doors, lots of doors to new market opportunities, and also fosters shared prosperity. So when you look at the work that we've been able to do at the United Nations Global Compact and the lot of pool of resources that we have, you have initiatives like our SDG Ambition Accelerator. We help the businesses to set achievable, ambitious goals and help them create actionable plans that will promote both sustainability and profitability. And then if you look at it like critically, sustainable business helps. The practices can drive success in business operations. It does reduce risk, it diversifies markets, and it also builds stronger stakeholder trust. So when you look at the business case for sustainability, it goes a long way, and businesses are beginning to see it. Like the stock take report you mentioned earlier, you see the CEOs are commenting that sustainability does help their business thrive. And sustainability is really a strategic priority for businesses who are intentional about it. The study shows that it opens up to 12 trillion USD in market opportunities across 4 economic systems. So we continue to mobilize the business sector in that regard to see that as much as you're contributing to societal goals, is also helping your business. And we at the Global Compact, we are a private sector initiative of the UN, and we always say that we are the voice of the private sector, and we are committed to continue to helping businesses tap into these opportunities while contributing to a sustainable future that is very inclusive for everyone.
Yeah, to your point on how sustainable business practice is actually good, I would say for the bottom line, it's good for the economy. When I talk about sustainability, I'm always going back to the word efficiency. Especially, I talk a lot about conversations in like manufacturing. If you can make your business practices more sustainable, a lot of times it's just making them more efficient, figuring out what to do with your waste, figuring out how to make your operations, more efficient. But another note that I have down, I recently read the new UN SDG 2024 report. And this shows that only 17% of the goals, the SDGs, are on track. And the SDGs have a deadline of 2030, and we're about to cross into 2025, which is 5 years out. So, I would just be curious from your seat, your thoughts on that 17% of how we're on track. and how we can you look into investment from the private sector in a place like Nigeria, and how we can work to improve that 17% over this next 5 years.
Yeah, that's a very important question because we have really regressed on the SDGs. The report says only 17% are on track, and it's been more challenging for developing countries like Nigeria. And so we continue to let the businesses know that they need to do more. We need to look at vulnerable groups, how to really, we just recently we had a conversation with the United Nations Human Rights Commission on how we can mobilize the private sector to get involved in internally displaced communities. So looking at vulnerable groups, trying to strengthen our laws, build strong institutions. In developing countries, one of the challenges that we face is the lack of strong institutions that support the actualization of the SDGs. So when we begin to build our institution and to continue to train capacity in that regard, both in the public and private sector, it goes a long way. And from what I have learned in the past years, I see that collaboration is incredibly important. We cannot take collaboration out of the conversation. So the need to really mobilize on public-private partnerships for the achievement of the SDGs is going to be very helpful. And then looking at the developing countries like Nigeria, we do not want to exclude domestic resource mobilization from the conversation. We need to get mobilization, resource ourselves, and then see how it can complement foreign direct investments. Looking at tax systems and how to use it to support SDG related projects, and then even try to work with like development partners, the World Bank, the International IMF and other institutions to see how they can support developing countries in the achievement of the SDGs. Just at the concluded UN General Assembly September, the Secretary General launched a Pact for the Future, which calls on more robust private sector, public sector engagement to take actions on the SDG. So we really cannot do without that. And if you look at it, the challenges are there. For example, in Nigeria, the ESG principles have moved from niche to mainstream, with particular relevance in Nigeria, where unique challenges present significant opportunities. You see, ESG focuses on environmental sustainability, social responsibility, and transformational governance. And when I spoke earlier about the need to really build our institution, regulation cannot be taken out of the conversation. I think it's time for us to move from voluntary to action. I like the conversations we had at Azerbaijan at COP29, where I just returned from 2 weeks ago. The need for us to continue to build regulations, moving from just voluntary and getting people to actually commit, and narrowing it down to the Nigerian business landscape. Our regulatory environment supports ESG adoption, with key laws like the Climate Change Act that was passed on by the new president, Mr. President Bolaji Tinubu. Then we have the Petroleum Industrial Act. We have the Nigerian Code of Corporate Governance that provides a framework for responsible business practices. Then you see the need for leadership is also very important. The need for people who are taking actions like leading companies. For example, we have the MTN Nigeria, a telco. We have financial services sector like First Bank of Nigeria. We have those in the food industry like Flour Mills of Nigeria, and those in the water sector, like the Nigerian breweries. They're working to integrate ESG into their operations, and they are driving innovation and strengthening reputation. So we continue to see ESG integration as a means to attract eco-conscious investors that fosters brand loyalty and enhance customer trust. So there's so much more, but yes, strong governance practices, the need for public-private partnership, domestic resource mobilization, and really making sure everybody thinks sustainability and the SDGs, addressing vulnerable groups, really move us really from commitment to action and really narrowing down the need to achieve the SDGs, given that we just have 5 years to go.
Yeah, you answered the question that I was going to ask, and that was around policy and what role policy plays in this whole conversation. Because, we're talking about the private sector, but I know in the U.S., in the last administration, the Biden-Harris administration, they passed a lot of policy around, climate-related things, and it really, I feel like, moved the needle with things. So I think policy plays a big role. But to your point on governance, one thing that I have down, I think it was back in 2023, this toolkit called the Governance Toolkit was released, and this supports Nigerian businesses in aligning with SDG 16, which is peace, justice, and strong institutions. Could you talk about this governance toolkit and how it's helping Nigerian businesses to meet this SDG or help meet this SDG 16?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm so proud to share that the UN Global Compact Network Nigeria did launch the Transformational Toolkit and Governance Toolkit in Nigeria, which really goes to the work that we're doing, really mobilizing the private sector to think of transformational governance and take actions to promote peace, just and strong institutions. So the toolkit was launched in Nigeria. It was meant to help Nigerian businesses align with SDG 16. So SDG 16 calls for peace, justice, and strong institutions. Just like I answered in your previous question, that we cannot take away strong institutions from the conversation when we talk about development. So, but back to your question on the toolkit, it's meant to provide a framework to strengthen governance practices. It's meant to improve accountability and ensure ethical behavior, which we know are very critical for attracting investment and driving growth. So as ESG expectations and regulations evolve, businesses they need tools like the toolkit for transformational governance to stay ahead of the compliance challenges. That's why we call it the TG corporate toolkit. That's why it was meant to equip companies with the tools that they will need to navigate ESG complexities and apply a transformational governance approach to their business and even core development work. And when I was at the event a week ago with the UN Human Rights Commission, I part of my submission at the panel was, no matter how much private sector put in funds or projects for development to address issues of internally displaced communities, if we don't have governance to guide them, the funds will be mismanaged, the projects will be mismanaged. So it's very important to have an actionable toolkit that will guide them through that process and make sure everyone is aligned. And a very fundamental aspect of the toolkit is that it has a self-assessment tool. So that tool enables it like actionable insights. And then there are recommendations to help businesses evaluate their current practices and identify areas for improvement. More like there's a lens. What are your practices on? What are the lapses and how can you do better? So if companies continue to leverage this toolkit, companies can align their operations with SDG 16 and then strengthen their governance practices and create lasting societal impact. So that was the idea of the toolkit. And I'm very pleased to share that businesses are taking actions. They are using the self-assessment tool and is guiding them as they walk towards that journey.
Yeah, that's incredible. One of the final things I'll say here, this conversation is cool because it's really come full circle. In 2023 during Climate Week, I met Paula Caballero, who is they say is the mind behind the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm trying to remember what exact place she helped develop the SDGs, but it was in South America. And I had Paula on the podcast in the past. And one of the conversations we talked about, her developing the SDGs, the idea, where it came from. But the conversation really came around this aspect of how do you bridge the economic and the environmental in a place like South America? Because similar to Africa, you have a lot of exports, right? You have a lot of exports, and you have a lot of. I pause to say this, but in some ways, environmental degradation in some aspects of things. So, like I said in the beginning, Nigeria, largest economy in Africa, primarily what I have driven by oil exports. So when you're driving the SDGs, driving ESG, driving environmental things, for a place like Nigeria, how do you bridge that together? Because you want to be more sustainable, but you realize that a large part of the economy is coming from oil exports and maybe drilling and mining. So that whole conversation, how do you have that? Because I know a lot of money is coming into the area from oil exports.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question, and you can see Nigeria has NDCs. Just as we return from Baku, we now call it the National Action Climate Plans for each country. So they have their NDCs that they have to reach up. They have to make sure that they meet their commitment. But like you said, lot of our revenue, we are oil producing country. But now the interesting part of it is that you begin to see companies are looking for other means of like investing in energy transition and renewable energy to really mitigate that. So like, for example, the first state-owned oil and gas company, the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, joined the UN Global Compact last year on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. And they're trying to see how they can really tie their actions to the global goals and also the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact. A lot of other companies like Owando PLC and others are really investing in clean energy. See, Owando PLC they recently signed I think it was last year, they signed an agreement with the state government in Lagos State, Nigeria, where our office is located. So they're currently, I think their project was to implement or bring in over thousands of electric vehicles into the country to really mitigate that. So you see others investing in solar. The NNPC, I think they decide to use sugarcane oil. That I'm trying to forget. I'm trying to remember what they're trying to explore as other means of investing in clean energy. So they're trying to meet these expectations. It's not easy. For a developing country, it's a journey. It's not, it's a marathon, not a sprint, but it's interesting to see that they're taking these actions, working on climate mitigation and adaptation, and also blended finance to really mitigate, like manage the process on environmental and climate change, because we cannot fold our arms and do nothing. Climate change is real and it's really affecting everyone, including children and youth, and the businesses and the governments really have a role to play in that regard.
Final thing here, we talked a lot about the private sector and mobilizing investment from the private sector. What role do philanthropic organizations play in this investment climate and in helping to achieve these SDGs?
Oh yes, philanthropy they play a huge role. Like I said earlier, when it comes to addressing or meeting the SDGs, it takes a multi-stakeholder approach. It takes collaboration, and the philanthropic organizations play a very crucial role in this in the conversation. Right, they have to support like local investments. When I say domestic resource mobilization, it could be global resource mobilization for philanthropic organizations globally, but they have to be part of the conversation. On the side of the UN General Assembly, the UN Global Compact Nigeria hosted an event in partnership with Milken Institute, and we had one of President Biden's advisory group on Africa, representative there, Almaz Nagesh. She's also the CEO of the African Diaspora Network based in Silicon Valley, California. So, and she talked about remittances. Remittances, a lot of funding come from Nigerians in the diaspora to fund even development projects and also take care of their families back home. So it all goes towards the addressing of the SDG. So we cannot exclude philanthropic organizations from the conversation. We need their support. All hands have to be on deck to really, really address the SDGs. Like you said, we are 5 years down and we regress backwards. So of course, everybody has a role to play, including philanthropic organizations. We need their support. They need to continue to work with stakeholders in the continent and outside of the continent to really address the SDGs.
Well, awesome. Well, Naomi, thank you so much for taking the time with us today, unpacking Nigeria and unpacking how we can achieve and get to these SDGs. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And if you could let me just one thing I missed out on saying was in March of 2024, the Nigerian Philanthropic Office launched an app in California, Silicon Valley, on the sidelines of the African Diaspora Network to really get the diaspora community to commit to supporting entrepreneurs in Nigeria through diaspora giving. So that is one, and addressing the SDGs on ending hunger and poverty. You have to empower entrepreneurs. You have to make them employable and create more jobs. So that's just one example of so many of how philanthropy really goes a long way in addressing the SDGs. Thank you.
Well, awesome. Yeah, thank you so much again.
Thanks for having me. Bye.